In this video, we're going to be looking at Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and specifically at the Biographia Literaria. In a later video, we'll be looking at his poems, and specifically Dejection and Ode. But I want to talk a little bit about Coleridge before we get started looking at him. Coleridge was famously the best friend for many years and collaborator with Wordsworth. As I mentioned when we started talking about Wordsworth, that originally Wordsworth's collection Lyrical Ballads was intended to be a collaborative effort between Wordsworth and Coleridge, with Wordsworth writing the poems having to do with natural events and Coleridge writing poems having to do with the supernatural. And in fact, the famous poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was originally written to be included in Lyrical Ballads. However, as I mentioned, Wordsworth wrote quickly. Coleridge tended to be a less rapid composer, and so Wordsworth was ready to go with his poems before Coleridge, so Coleridge allowed Wordsworth to go ahead and publish it on his own. And Lyrical Ballads then became solely Wordsworth's work. Coleridge was actually quite a famous figure in the 19th century, not only because he was a friend of Wordsworth, who was also a famous figure, but because he was a prolific author. He was obviously the writer of poetry, Frost at Midnight, This Lime Tree Bower My Prison, Dejection and Ode, Kubla Khan, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. These are all very successful poems. He also was a writer of criticism of other authors' works and more literary criticism types of works. His essays on Shakespeare are famous. He wrote several plays, some of which were quite successful and played in England at a time when the play was the popular form of entertainment. So he was successful as a playwright, and also a variety of essays on other topics. Also, he was famous as a public speaker. His lectures, delivered as part of a public lecture series, became celebrated and a must-see event for many people in the intellectual and social elite. And he was quite successful. And then in his later years, he became known as the Sage of Highgate. And visitors would come sit in his parlor while he would muse upon various topics, and they would listen to him talk. And he became sort of a famously wise person. He was originally, obviously, along with Wordsworth, a revolutionary, planning for and hoping for the massive change in English society. But in his later years, he became famously conservative, both politically and religiously conservative. And in fact, John Stuart Mill recognizes him in an essay called Bentham and Coleridge as one of the two major figures of the first half of the 19th century. Jeremy Bentham representing the reform-minded, what we would think of as liberal group, and Coleridge representing the conservative group who seeks to preserve things the way things are. And Mill recognizes both of them as being important contributors to 19th century thought. So we'll be looking at the Biographia. The Biographia was originally, and you'll notice that you don't have very much of it. It's pretty thick. The Biographia was what it literally translates as literary biography, but it's Coleridge's extended arguments about the nature of poetry. And the first half of the book, up through chapters 13 and 14, which we'll be looking at, is an extended logical argument, borrowing heavily from German idealistic philosophy, attempting to prove that the poet's imaginative perception, his way of looking at the world, the thing that M.H. Abrams would call the lamp, their perspective that changes the world around them, is a representation of truth. Obviously, he's writing in a post-Lockean universe where we have no essential or a priori ideas. We aren't born with ideas embedded in our brains. And so all of our knowledge comes from observation. And since it all comes from observation, it's all based upon and derived from experience. And therefore, It's not derived from some predetermined truth. So how do you establish that it is, that what you know or what you believe is true? And Coleridge goes on an extended logical argument, going through fully this much of this book, this part right here, trying to prove that the poet's perception is a perception of truth. And he does it logically deriving it from a syllogistic reasoning based upon the one thing that you can know for sure, which is that I exist. That's the only thing I can know for sure. Everything else is based upon perception. And so using that and using extended passages taken from German idealistic philosophers like Schelling and Fichte and Schiller, he seeks to prove that what the poet sees is actually a perception of truth. And that's very important when we look at the role of the imagination in the chapters we'll be looking at now. Then also, of course, in a famous discussion, he addresses Wordsworth's theory that the language of low and rustic life is the true language of poetry, objecting that, in fact, the language of low and rustic life is limited in its ability to express ideas and has its own infelicities that damage it as an expressive medium, and instead argues in favor of what he calls the lingua communis, the common language, which is language that everyone can understand and connect with. And he argues, in fact, that Wordsworth himself shares his belief, even though Wordsworth is unwilling to admit it. So now we're going to start looking specifically at the Biographia Literaria and talking about his concept of the imagination. Now, the Biographia Literaria was originally intended to be a preface, similar to Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, to a collection of Coleridge's poems. But in typical Coleridge fashion, it quickly grew into something long enough to be a book in its own right, and actually quite a lengthy book in its own right. We're going to be looking at two main characteristics of this, two main points of discussion in his text. The first one is the nature of the imagination, how the imagination relates both to the poet and to the poem. And the second one is Coleridge's definition of poetry, which turns out to be extremely important for conceptions of poetry in the 20th century especially. And then also, incidentally, we'll take a quick look at the disagreement between Wordsworth and Coleridge over the nature of poetic language. So first we're going to look at the relationship between fancy and the imagination, and Coleridge's conception of what the imagination is. And then we are going to come back later and look at the actual text and talk about what's going on in the text by looking at specific passages. But I think it's helpful if we get the concepts nailed down first, and then we'll be able to go back and look at the passages. First, we have to make this distinction between fancy and the imagination that Coleridge will address at the end of chapter 13. He's making a distinction between two terms which are often seen as synonymous. Fantasy and imagination were regarded by people in Coleridge's own time, as well as people in our time, as two different words meaning roughly the same thing. And Coleridge acknowledges as much, that imagination, or the Latin term imaginatio, is a translation of the Greek term fantasai. But he also acknowledges that in reality there are several significant differences. So let's look briefly at those differences, because these will be important in understanding his definition of the imagination, and will also be important in looking at how the term imagination is used later, especially when we look at Shelley's defense of poetry. All right, so the word fantasai, the Greek word, which ultimately becomes the basis of our word fantasy, as well as fancy, fantasize, phantasm, and fantasia, all of which derive from this word, is originally derived from a Greek word meaning mental images that were derived from sensory impressions. And that will be important when we think of the term fancy for Coleridge in a bit. So they are memories of things you have sensed, and they can be visual images, they can be auditory images, they can be sounds, they can be smells, any sensory image. And they're associated with memory. So they're things you once saw but now remember. On the other hand, the Latin term imaginatio is different in that it suggests an actual creative power. It's not simply pulling memories out of your brain from things you've seen in the past, but actually creating new images. So it's basically associated with creativity. And the English derivatives, the words that we've derived from imaginatio in English, are imagination, obviously imagine, and image. So there's a difference between mental images, which are simply pulled out of your memory storage, and things that you have created on your own through this power of imagination. To make this distinction clear, imagination is an essentially creative power as distinguished from fancy, which are simply images recalled from memory. Now, in the Biographia, Coleridge will distinguish the imagination into two subcategories, and then he will distinguish those two subcategories further from the fancy. So the first subcategory he's going to talk about is called the primary imagination. The primary imagination, as Coleridge describes it, is a power of perception. Literally, it is the act of seeing. This is consistent with what contemporary psychologist, philosopher Jacques Lacan describes as in his use of the imagination. The imaginary for Lacan is that which has been seen, because when we see, we always use the act of imagination in perception. In other words, seeing is never simply a passive act of receiving sensory impressions. Our sensory impressions are always mediated through our understanding and connected with other things through the imagination. The real for Lacan is that which has not yet been perceived. It is what a philosopher would call the phenomenal. The phenomenal is those things in themselves independent of perception. To see what I'm on about here, we need to talk a little bit about the psychology and the mechanism of perception. And so I do this in my Writing 2 classes as well, because it's important to understand how we see. And one of the things I do is I first immediately ask people, with what organ do we see? And of course, the immediate response most people make is with our eyes. We see with our eyes, but that's not true at all. Our eyes are only the mechanical receptors that receive the stimuli, but we don't actually see with our eyes. In fact, our eyes are connected through the optic nerve with our brain, and our brain decides what we see. In many cases, it's actually quite true that you can't see something that you haven't learned to see. If you think of one of those 3D images where if you stare at it long enough, you can eventually see dolphins jumping in the ocean, you'll understand what I'm talking about. At first, it's just noise. It doesn't make any sense. But after a while, your brain can start to tease out shapes. So the reality is that even though we perceive physical stimuli through the mechanism in which photons strike the rods and cones at the back of our retina, which turns those impulses into electrical signals which go to our brain. It's our brain which decides what we see. And more importantly, it decides how we understand what we see. So for example, if your brain were to see a person, and this person in this particular case is Mr. Bean, British comedian, otherwise known as Rowan Atkinson, your brain will see this, and in some cases your brain will see simply a funny-looking man. But those of us who are familiar with British comedy will immediately see this as Mr. Bean and then interpret this in terms of funny, very silly television personality and in the larger atmosphere of British BBC television comedy. And so our brain builds all those particular connections. In fact, that's what Coleridge and later theorists like Lacan call the imagination. It's worthwhile looking at the mechanism of perception in order to understand how this works at even a very basic level. When your eye sees an object outside of itself, when it receives visual stimulus from the world outside, let's say you see a tree. That image is projected through the lens of your eye onto your retina upside down. The image is sent to your brain upside down, but then your brain, understanding that trees are right side up, flips it back over. And in fact, there have been perceptual experiments where people have worn glasses that flip the image over upside down. So it strikes the retina on their eye right side up. And then after about 3 days, their brain will flip the image over using what it knows to be logically true about the external world in order to correct the vision. And then, of course, they take off the glasses and they're completely screwed up. So, and this is an important point to get down, the primary imagination is a spontaneous method or spontaneous act, not a willed act, but a spontaneous act of perceiving. So when a poet goes out into the world and looks around and he sees the glorious sunshine glinting off the damp grass in the morning and feels inspiration, he's seeing through his imagination. And you and I can see through our imaginations as well. Okay, so the secondary imagination, on the other hand, he says, does coexist with the conscious will and is implemented by the conscious will, and therefore it is under the control of the poet. It's what is used to make the poem. So whereas the primary imagination is spontaneous and it's an act of perception, the secondary imagination is put into effect by the will, used to create poems out of the material provided by the primary imagination. So the primary imagination is the quote-unquote poetic power. It's the power of poetry. And the secondary imagination is the poemic power, the power of creating poems from poetry. And we'll be looking at the difference between poetry and poems in a bit as well. On the other hand, the fancy is simply images recalled from memory. It has nothing to do with the imagination. It is simply a storehouse of images that you have collected from your past experiences and can regurgitate at will. So for Wordsworth, the imagination is the power that produces true poetry. Poetry that comes out of the fancy is simply a catalog of facts. It has no poetic power. And so he will describe several poems. He makes a distinction between Milton and Cooper. Milton being the imaginative poet, Cooper being the poet of fancy. Cooper, C-O-W-P-E-R, is pronounced Cooper. Okay, so that takes us to the distinction between poetry and the poem. As I suggested before, for Coleridge, poetry is a product of the primary imagination. It is essentially creative. It exists in the perception of the poet. He says at one point that the question, what is poetry, is so connected to the question of what is a poet that it's impossible to answer the one without answering the other. So poetry is an essential characteristic of the poetic imagination. The poem, on the other hand, when he seeks to define the poem, he first acknowledges that anything that sort of has meter and form added to it could be called a poem. So you could call 30 days has September, April, June, and November, all the rest have 31. You could call that a poem in the broader sense. But Coleridge doesn't agree that that is in fact what makes a poem. What makes a poem is that it embodies the primary imagination. It embodies the products of the primary imagination. It embodies poetry, but it uses the secondary imagination, the power of recreating poems in order to dissolve, in order to unify. So in order to take all of those elements supplied by the primary imagination and create out of that an organic whole. And he says that a poem of any length cannot be all poetry. So the job of the primary imagination is to create the poetry. The job of the secondary imagination is to take that material, integrate it in with the other material that comes in between, and produce a unified organic whole. And this notion of an organic whole becomes very important in the 20th century for the new critics who believed the poem is an artifact on its own, cut off from any external factor, and that what makes a poem is this essential integration of every element in the poem into every other element. The idea is that for a perfectly crafted poem, you cannot change a single word without changing the meaning of the whole poem in an essential way, because each word depends upon a network of meaning built up by connections with all of the other words in the poem. And if you change any one word, you intrinsically change every other word in the poem's meaning as well. And so therefore, a poem is an organic whole. And the new critics, that's capital N, capital C, a group of critics evolving out of Russian formalism in the 20th century, and who were very powerful in the 50s and 60s and were just sort of waning in their power in the 70s. When I was in graduate school, the new critics were still around, but they were kind of seen as dinosaurs. But they saw this as an essential characteristic, and they even embodied it in one of their doctrines called the heresy of paraphrase, that paraphrasing a poem essentially destroys the meaning of the poem. You can't restate a poem in any other words but the poem's own. And of course, the other thing the new critics believed was that biography and history did not matter when you interpreted a poem. It was a self-contained whole, and you did not look at the biography of the poet. That was totally irrelevant. The intention of the poet, they called it the intentional fallacy, was irrelevant. The history out of which the poem was written was irrelevant. You looked at the poem as an integrated whole within itself, without any reference to anything outside of itself. So now we're going to be turning to the Biographia itself. We will be looking at chapter 13 and 14, Coleridge's discussion of the imagination versus the fancy, Coleridge's discussion of the nature of the poem, and also we're going to briefly take a look at Coleridge's distinction about the nature of poetic language, as opposed to what Wordsworth had described in his preface.